back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic, every week we profile some of the most amazing developments in science and technology that touches all of us. Now, in the past, we've had a number of scientists, astronomers, aerospace engineers, and even astronauts on the radio show. But today, we're going to talk about the people, the history, the visionaries. These are the people who actually made history by pushing the space program. So with us today is Fred Natus. He's a science journalist, author of a new book. It's called Star Settlers, the Billionaires, Geniuses, and the Crazed Visionaries Out to Conquer the Universe. So we'll be talking about the history, the passion, the vision of those people who are making history exploring outer space. So, Fred, glad you could be on Science Fantastic.
Thanks so much for having me.
First question for you is, how did you, as a young kid, get interested in the science program, and what motivated you to write this book, Star Settlers?
Yeah, as a kid, I was more of a comic book fan than a science fiction fan, but it caught up with me by my 20s, and I was looking for a new topic for a book, and as you mentioned, I had just written a book about early history of science fiction and pulp science fiction, and I was pretty fascinated by how Mars had been such a motivator for people, their imaginations, starting in the 1880s to the early 1900s. There was a lot of speculation that there were channels or canals on Mars. This was championed by a lot of leading astronomers at the time, and some pushed it even further, especially Percival Lowell in the U.S., who actually built an observatory in Arizona just to prove the thesis that there was a civilization on Mars, or at least that had built these channels on Mars. And I really think that this helped jumpstart science fiction altogether. It became a popular fad. There were songs written about Mars, the Martian Two-Step. There were lots of plays and books. One was a little bit like a Christmas story with a Martian coming to Earth and reforming a cranky, greedy old man. There were lots of novels in German, in Russian, and of course H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds was probably one of the most prominent of these. So I felt like there was something there, and also I think I was a little slow to it. I think a lot of people who get interested in astronomy, it's like a switch goes in their head, and they see things differently, and are fascinated by stuff that the rest of us, at least, may not be. And the Mars rover photos of the surface of Mars were just, I think, a revelation for a lot of people. And I began to suspect that something had changed a little bit culturally. I'm a cultural historian. I don't have quantitative proof of this, but just a sense that even the word spacefaring had become popularized as opposed to just talking about space flight or rocketry. This idea that our whole orientation of the civilization might be towards space. And so that was really the origins of where I began the book.
And your book differs from other books about the space program, which dwells about the astronauts and the technology and what's out there. Your book concentrates on the people, the theoreticians, the engineers, the visionaries, the billionaires, and their passion and dreams. So I'd like to start with two of them, one Russian, one German. The first is Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who was pretty much penniless most of his life, but laid the theoretical groundwork for what it would take using Newton's laws of motion to explore the universe. And then we have the opposite, Werner von Braun, born into the German aristocracy, a member of the Nazi Party, who is the father of modern rocketry. So tell us a little bit about these two individuals. What motivated them, and what inspired them to make such great contributions?
Yeah, I think there was similar inspiration for both of them. Tsiolkovsky said that he was born I think around the mid-19th century. He was one of about 17 or 18 children born to a forester. So they're very provincial Russians. His mother came from a family of, I think, like fix-it people, artisans of that type. And at an early age, he had an accident that left him deaf, and this created a sense of isolation for him as a child. And of course, he had a huge imagination and intellectual capacities. So he was reading his older siblings' science libraries, and he had this almost mystical notion that if you could escape from gravity, in one of his books, he had a character called the Gravity Hater. He had this idea that it almost be like a religious or blissful state of floating around, and he draws pictures of this, and this became a touch note for him. He also did read books like Jules Verne, and he went to Moscow as a teenager, penniless pretty much. He had a small allowance his father sent him, and he met up with a fellow by the name of Nikolai Fedorov, who had been an itinerant school teacher, but had become a librarian in the country's only public library at that point in Moscow. And Fedorov had a group of disciples, again, poor scholars, who he served as their university instructor. He brought them books every day. If they were hungry, he'd hand them some money for food, clothes if they're freezing. And Fedorov was another brilliant eccentric, I have to say. He was a devout Russian Orthodox Christian. He lived something of an ascetic, almost saintly lifestyle. He barely ate. He slept very little. He had very few possessions, like a rented room, and supposedly he slept on a metal trunk that was arched on the top, so you could never really get comfortable. I imagine with at least an overcoat over him. But he was certainly not somebody seeking luxury. And Fedorov had even wilder ideas. He was very much excited by the scientific revolution. However, he too was a mystic, a religious mystic, and he had a theory that the common task of humanity was to end death. Death just was annoying, it was getting in the way. It was an insult. And he thought that all of humanity should be banding together to find ways to end death. And, of course, he went through medical research, new technologies. He even, and in a sense, this was part of his Christianity. He believed that this would be a great resurrection effort. And he wanted to resurrect all the dead. And, of course, I don't know how he would do that, but he believed that technology would find a way.
Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. In this hour, we're talking about the visionaries, the billionaires, the people who have the passion, the foresight, and the knowledge to lay the foundation for the space program. Well, we began a short discussion with Tsiolkovsky, this penniless Russian who used Newton's laws of motion to lay out what it would take to go to the moon or Mars. Think about it, actual calculations which we study even today about what it would take to go to outer space. And then let's move on now to a German who actually put this theory into hard steel. He was a member of the German aristocracy. He was Werner von Braun, a member of the Nazi Party. And there's a song about him saying that he only cares where the missiles go up. He doesn't care where the missiles come down, specifically over London. So tell us a little bit now about Werner von Braun. Why did this member of the aristocracy become the father of modern rocketry?
Yeah, so Werner von Braun came of age at a time when there was a big rocketry craze in Europe. Particularly, as I was mentioning, in Russia and in Germany, there were amateur rocketry societies developing, and there were industrialists encouraging research into things like rocket cars and rocket trains and rocket planes and daredevils trying to ride these things. And so von Braun was fascinated with rocketry from an early age. He realized that he couldn't understand any of it until he studied math, and so he's a reluctant student of math. In any case, as a college student, he fell in with this group of amateur rocketry enthusiasts in like 1929, and they were working on an airfield abandoned munitions field outside of Berlin. Everybody was working there for free. This was a time when the German economy was in turmoil, so people were living there in bunkers. They were getting food from a soup kitchen, and they had a lot of skilled mechanics and engineers working with them. And within a few years, these amateurs were succeeding in lifting rockets, and the German army becomes interested and suggests that they might want to join the army at a research facility. And most of von Braun's older colleagues were like, no thanks, we're not really eager to take that path. Von Braun, however, as you mentioned, was quite, you have to call him an opportunist, a very charming, affable person who knew how to get along with people and to manipulate them. In any case, he said absolutely. Soon, within a few years, they had some terrific test flights. In the meantime, the Nazis had taken over the country, and so he was working for the Nazis. He was required to become an SS officer, and they were working on their missile program, basically. The British soon bombed the base on the Baltic where they were working on these secret weapons, and Hitler ordered them to build these underground cavernous workshops in the mountains. And the fact is they had a whole concentration camp of like a death camp of workers building, thousands of these bombs. Pretty remarkable. And they managed to launch a couple thousand of them before the end of World War II, raining them down on London and Antwerp, other places, I think Brussels, killing a couple thousand. But the real tragedy was about 20,000 workers had been worked to death or died of diseases or exposure or starvation. In any case, von Braun keeps landing on his feet. He knows that the Nazis are not going to win the war, and he maneuvers to get to the mountains away from the action in the last days. He even remarked, I just learned that Hitler committed suicide, but the hotel service and wine is wonderful. He soon surrendered to the U.S. Army. They were eager to have him. They wanted to take about 25 technicians for 6 months to U.S. He instead talked them into taking 100 of his colleagues, and most of them spent the rest of their lives in the U.S. and became citizens. And, of course, first thing they were doing was launching V-2 rockets in the desert, White Sands. They then moved to Huntsville, Alabama, working on missile systems. And von Braun, when Sputnik took America by surprise, von Braun's team within 6 months had built a rocket capable of carrying the satellite explorer to outer space. So this made him a culture hero at a time where everybody was reeling from the idea that the USSR was ahead of America in the space race. And he went on to be appointed a director of the Marshall Center for NASA, helping develop some of the rockets like the Jupiter and the Mercury rockets that lofted the Gemini program and the Mercury program, and indeed the Saturn rockets that were used in the Apollo program. And he then became a strategist for NASA, and a lot of his extravagant demands for excursions to Mars immediately were turned down, and he retired. But he had for a long time there in the 1950s, he was really a culture hero. He appeared on the Walt Disney Hour, some space specials. There was a whole magazine series in Collier's, the 7-part series, in which he introduced ideas about outer space. And he really took on the persona of a patriotic American anti-communist. He said we could build space stations for scientific research, but we could also load them up with atomic weapons, and we could destroy any targets on the Earth if we wanted to. So he spoke this real Cold Warrior talk. And I think as the astronauts came into prominence, he sort of fell out of the prominence as the leader of the space movement in the U.S., but he certainly reigned there for a long time.
Okay, well, let's move on because you have so many visionaries, billionaires, and interesting individuals that are profiled in your book. Let's move on now.
Sure.
And, of course, it was von Braun who talked about going to Mars, but then it was a Princeton professor, Gerard O'Neill. So tell us a little bit about Professor O'Neill.
Sure. Gerard O'Neill was a professor at Princeton, and he worked on cyclotrons, I believe, and he got sort of tired, apparently, of the academic life and applying for grants and et cetera. And he, as a kind of an adventure, he applied to be a scientist with NASA, a scientist astronaut with NASA. He made it through a few rounds of the program, but he's slightly older. At the time, he's already 40. And he ended up getting winnowed out, and this is a real crushing blow to him at the time. But he then went on to come up with this idea of building space colonies that would basically be in the same orbit as the moon around the Earth at the Lagrange point, so about 60 degrees off of the moon on either side. And he claimed that you could park thousands of space colonies in these areas. And he had pretty grand ideas of building these things using, not bringing materials up, but extracting materials from the moon and launching them into space, fabricating all the materials you need to create these giant space colonies. Some of them would have square acres as large as Maryland or some different states like that. His favorite plan was giant rotating cylinders that you would, you could look up into the sky and see the colony opposite you. But he had this. It became very popular. In fact, he spoke to Congress about it. Governor Jerry Brown in California was a big enthusiast, and this led to his nickname, Governor Moonbeam, at the time. And there was a whole grassroots interest in it. These L5 societies started to appear on college and high school campuses with the slogan L5 by 95. So there was this hope in 1975 that within 20 years we'd have these giant space colonies, and that they would help with the energy crisis at the time, and they'd help clean up the environment because they would be beaming, they would harvest solar energy and beam it down by microwaves to rectenna on the Earth. So it was a very, I guess you'd call it utopian, idealistic effort. And again, just in recent years, Jeff Bezos has jumped onto this idea and thinks this is the real answer.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. In this hour, we're talking about not just the space program, but the people, the visionaries, the billionaires who are pushing a new agenda. NASA had a goal. The goal was to, quote, beat the Russians. Well, we did it. And after that, NASA became the agency to nowhere. That is, it sort of lost its way. That is, it doesn't go anywhere anymore. But now we have this influx of visionaries and, yes, billionaires who are pushing a different agenda. Before the break, we were talking about Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon, richest man on the planet Earth. And he has a different vision, not just to beat the Russians, but he wants to make the Earth a celestial garden. That's right, a celestial garden with no pollution. All the hard industry that pollutes could be in outer space. And he envisions millions of people living in outer space. And of course, normally, a crackpot like that would be sent to the loony farm, but this guy happens to be the richest man in the world. So tell us now, what sparked a billionaire to finance his own rocket program called Blue Origin?
I can't speculate into the psychology totally, but certainly he has, in interviews, said that he was a big science fiction buff as a teenager, adolescent.
Star Trek in particular, he was.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, you're right. Of course, he wanted to call Amazon originally "Make It So," I believe. He was a big fan of Captain Picard. But he, even as a teenager, he had envisioned someday building space hotels and space amusement parks. And so he's recently, of course, he's looking to profit from satellite systems and getting involved in moon colonization and so on. But I think there is some utopian or idealism underneath that, where he really he likes that science fiction vision, and he thinks that, O'Neill's way is perhaps just to distinguish himself from Elon Musk, who's gung-ho on colonizing Mars. He likes the idea of not being on a planetary surface. You use much less energy landing or taking off or carrying materials, perhaps even manufacturing materials. And so his idea, again, I think the environmental movement in the 70s led people to think that we had to limit ourselves, limit resources, and this bothered people like Bezos who envision, expansion and grand destinies for humanity. So he seized on Jared O'Neill's ideas. In fact, he's said in at least one of O'Neill's lectures, because he was a student at Princeton also. So his vision is somewhat similar, that most of the population will be living off-planet, and Earth, as you said, will become a kind of a wilderness preserve for perhaps visiting now and then, and leaving it alone to the animals. One of his space colonies painting shows a moose on top of a cliff, so you can imagine a moose in outer space in a natural setting. That's his vision, at least, that he's presenting to the public.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Once again, with us on the line is Fred Natus, science journalist, author of a number of great books, including The Man from Mars, Ray Palmer's amazing pulp journey about the origin of science fiction, and also Star Settlers, his latest book, The Billionaires, Geniuses, and the Crazed Visionaries Out to Conquer the Universe. Where we last left off, let's talk about the billionaires who are now rewriting the agenda for the space program. It used to be that people followed the antics of the astronauts, and young kids dreamed about becoming an astronaut, going on to the Apollo space program. But then, well, it all collapsed. Why? Cost. It costs a lot of money to go into outer space. $10,000 to put a pound of anything into near-Earth orbit. That is your weight in gold. Think of your body made out of solid gold. That's what it costs to put you into outer space. But now, we're talking about one day mom and dad may go into outer space. So tell us now a little bit about Blue Origin, the fact that the richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon, is funding a fleet of rockets, one rocket to take passengers, tourists, into outer space, and another one to go all the way to the moon. So tell us about Blue Origin.
Sure. I will also add in Virgin Galactic, Richard Branson's company, as far as the tourism business, and I think both may very well this year begin taking tourists up on suborbital flights to experience microgravity for a few minutes. And, of course, they're not doing this as a public service. That you pay $200,000 or $250,000 per ticket, and that is a round trip. But so I think, again, they are businessmen, and they see a possible business plan here. As far as Bezos he's certainly angling, I'm sure, for government contracts or military contracts. And, of course, he and Musk are in competition for setting up new satellite systems for telecommunications. So for him, I think it's expanding his business empire as far as he can take it. But there's also this idea that if you go into outer space, you experience what some people call the overview effect, which is almost like a religious experience of realizing that the world should be united, and the nation states are something of a fiction in some ways, and so people have a kind of a holistic vision of the Earth and people's destiny and role on the Earth. So these tourist agencies are also selling this idea: you can become an ambassador back to the Earth and help us through all our problems with global warming and ecological issues.
Okay, now let's shift gears and talk about another billionaire, Elon Musk, that you alluded to. Many people compare him to Tony Stark, the alter ego of Iron Man. The science, genius, industrialist, capitalist billionaire, all rolled up into one, Tony Stark. So tell us a little about the origin of where did Elon Musk come from? Comes from South Africa, humble origins, and skyrockets to become one of the leaders of the space program. How did that happen?
Well, it sounds like he has a lot of ambition and brilliance. He said he was a comic book fanatic as a child and adolescent, and started doing video game programming and that sort of thing. But he claims that his whole vision for creating his empire with his different holdings, the car company, Tesla, Solar City, SpaceX, and any other businesses I left out right now, he says that the whole purpose of that is because he's really serious about colonizing Mars. He just is fixated on the idea of creating a backup planet for humanity, a Earth 2.0, and he keeps talking about having a multiplanetary future. So he's concerned that there might be a comet or asteroid strike that could destroy the Earth, or pandemics that wipe people out, and we need to start seeding other planets or surfaces to avoid this future.
Back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. In this hour, we're talking to Fred Natus, author of the book Star Settlers. You know, it used to be that NASA was called the Agency to Nowhere. I mean, it didn't really do anything for so many decades, except, of course, send satellites to the great planets of our solar system. But other than that, we didn't really go anywhere. And the reason for that is simple: cost. It costs a lot of money to go into outer space, and bureaucrats are wary about raising taxes to pay for it. Well, things have changed. Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are now billionaires opening up their checkbooks, not to mention the fact that Elon Musk is pioneering reusable rockets that you can use over and over again, thereby dropping the cost of space travel, some people think, by a factor of 10. Meaning that one day mom and dad can go into outer space. But anyway, let's talk about going back into outer space with the Falcon rocket, which successfully launched our astronauts to the space station recently, and then the Mars program, where he's fielding a Mars rocket of his own design. Could you elaborate?
Only that I've seen videos of test flights. They already have prototypes of this. Lately it's been called the Starship for a while. I think it was called the BFR. In any case, he's built another space port down in Texas, I believe near the Rio Grande, or Brownsville, and they seem to be already having some success with test flights. So he's in some ways on pace to conceivably be getting to Mars by the 2030s. He mentions that these rockets, obviously they could hold a lot of freight, but they also can hold up to 120 passengers, which is pretty remarkable and would fit into his vision of creating these actual colonies on Mars if that comes to fruition.
Now, there's also a split among astronauts about how to do it. Elon Musk and some individuals say, let's just jump to Mars. You know, we don't need the moon. I mean, the moon is a dead end. Not interesting anyway. Let's just jump to Mars. Other people say, let's do it the tried and true method. First, building a lunar orbiter, and then from that lunar orbiter, then create a Mars rocket that can take us to Mars. So, baby steps by baby steps. So, what are your thoughts? You've interviewed a lot of these people. What are your thoughts about whether or not you think we should take baby steps to Mars, that is, through the moon, or simply take that giant leap into the unknown?
Yeah, as you said, there was a lot of debate about this, and when I first started researching, there was little discussion of the moon at all. Everybody seemed to be fixated either on robotic exploration or a Mars direct sort of idea. And NASA really didn't have any specific plans for Mars. It was all kicked down the road just some decades to come. However, I think there's been a lot of push, perhaps comes from the aerospace industry in terms of what's doable. But I think there can be an argument made. I have heard, like Buzz Aldrin wrote, that he thought that it would be better to launch a Mars mission from low Earth orbit, or at least Earth orbit, where rockets could be assembled and go on to Mars. that the moon really wasn't necessary, but other people argue, well, if your goal is colonization or settlement, the moon sure is an easier and safer place to try out systems and develop fail-safes and conceivably, rescue people or bring them what they need. Because with Mars, the window's only open every 2 years and 2 months. And people really are going to be marooned there if something goes wrong. So that seems to be where the split is. I'm not really an expert, so I'm just a hangers-on trying to find what's going to happen. I got to admit that I think Mars is a lot more romantic idea. Buzz Aldrin said of the moon shortly after stepping onto it that it was magnificent desolation, and he later said, it's no place to set up shop, really. So we'll see.
Okay, and also in your book, Star Settlers, you make comments about even going to the stars. Another billionaire is trying to sponsor the first Starship. Not like the Enterprise, but a small device the size of maybe a paperclip. But what are your thoughts about another billionaire going to the stars?
Oh, okay. Well, I think Yuri Milner's plan, as you say, I did interview the scientist who came up with the idea, as far as I know, at the University of California here, where I happen to live. It's Santa Barbara, and Philip Lubin. And his idea was to use a whole array of lasers that apparently are brought into phase, so that instead of having one giant laser, which no one can build, you have thousands or millions even of small lasers that are somehow focused together, and you can do the same thing. And again, there were studies of this about a decade ago that made it look impossible, but I believe with microwaves. It's just way too costly. The amount of electricity required was more than the Earth could produce. However, I think Lubin's plan at least seems feasible to a lot of people. And the idea is to send out, like you say, a 1-gram Starship loaded with sensors and radio communications that would be able to shoot off to Alpha Centauri star system and send back information.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time. However, Fred, thank you so much for being on Science Fantastic.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed speaking.